Hi, I'm Julie Gurman, and I'm here to talk with you this afternoon about Chapter 1 of Dr. Ruby Payne's book of Emotional Poverty. Chapter 1 discusses the idea of what it is that causes students to explode or be out of control in the classroom. The pages that we'll be referring to throughout this section are pages 11 through 20. So when we're talking about students that are unable to control themselves and their emotions, or they become explosive, especially our younger children, we're talking about children that have an unregulated and unintegrated brain. So let's talk a little bit more about what that means. First of all, we know through lots of different research, but especially Dr. Stephen Stosny in his book called The Powerful Self, he speaks to the idea that emotion is processed very, very quickly in our brains, anywhere from 200 to 5,000 times faster than thought or decision-making or language. And so it's no wonder then that understanding how that emotional charge occurs and what we can do to help support children with that is so vitally important. One of the things that we know is that the brain in and of itself cannot and does not name or control emotional response. Much of what happens during a traumatic episode or a scary or unpleasant event that might occur in a child's life occurs in such a way that their emotions just take over, and the brain is not capable, without lots of support and lots of help and practice, it's not capable of putting a name to that emotion or thought. Babies aren't born out of the womb being able to tell us that they're hungry or tired or need their diaper changed or they're happy or content. We have to learn that through watching their behaviors and their emotional state. And so, again, it's important that we understand that this truly is the definition of an unregulated and unintegrated brain, one that is not able to put a name to or control their emotional response. For the next few minutes, we're going to be talking about a hand model of the brain that you can create and take back with you and replicate with your students, with your staff, with your colleagues, that gives us a simple way to begin to think about how the brain functions and the inner workings of the brain as it applies to having an explosive or out of control behavior event. So you'll notice that I've drawn on this piece of paper up here a simple diagram of my hand model of the brain, and I'd encourage you to do the same thing so that you can begin to label those things as we go throughout the rest of this section of our presentation. So first of all, we're going to think about the palm of our hand as the brainstem. This is kind of the area where all involuntary systems operate. Breathing, heartbeat, all of those things happen involuntarily in the brainstem. So you might want to label this area of your hand print, the brainstem, and this area, the arm and the wrist, as the spinal cord. So what what does the brainstem do? It controls states of arousal. It controls when you become hungry. It controls when you get sleepy. It controls that involuntary reflex of waking up without an alarm. Some of us are able to do that without an alarm. And it controls sexual arousal. What it also controls is what we call the flee, fight, flight response that occurs when the brain goes into survival mode. When something significant happens that we feel like we are in danger, we are in a place that we don't have control over what's going to happen to us, that survival mode, the brain reacts in that brainstem area by going into that flee, fight, flight mode. The brainstem also controls things like motivational systems, that instinct to look for food when you're hungry, the instinct to look for a place to get shelter from the rain or from bad weather, that instinct that just kicks in when something dangerous is about to happen and you begin to look for somewhere to go to be safe. It also works with the limbic area, which we'll talk about in just a moment. It works with the limbic area to create a reaction within you to get you to act. So if we were to say that our thumb is the entire limbic system, obviously we know that we've got two hemispheres of our brain, so we would be looking at, in an accurate model, we'd be looking at both of our thumbs, but for our model today, we're just going to worry about our one hand. So our thumb here, we would want to label as our limbic system. It's this part of the brain that becomes your emotional self. This is the area of the brain that controls, or where emotion begins to develop. There's a small portion of the limbic system, and we're going to use the representation of it being just the tip of your thumb. That is what's called the amygdala. And this amygdala is an important piece of your limbic system because this is kind of communication central for the limbic part of your brain. Also within the limbic system, there's what we call the hippocampus, which also is this whole area of our brain model. We would say this area of your thumb, that when it is folded in is what makes up the limbic system. Things that begin to happen within that limbic system are things that start attaching emotional memory to events that occur. For instance, when babies are very, very small, they learn that when they cry, something will happen. Hopefully, when they cry, they're being picked up, they're being nurtured, they're being comforted, and then they begin to attach that memory to know that if they are hungry and they cry, someone will bring them a bottle and feed them. When they're tired and they cry, someone will rock them or pat them or help them get settled down to be able to go to sleep. If it's time for their diaper to be changed, if they cry, it sends a signal to their caregiver to tend to them. It works in the reverse as well, in that when they're happy and content, They begin to sense that feeling of relaxed state with their caregiver, and the emotions that are exchanged between the bonding that is exchanged between the caregiver and the child during those happy moments also attaches memory, so that they remember that when I behave this way, when I coo and laugh and giggle as a baby, that's going to make someone pay attention to me in a more pleasant way. So clearly, what's going on in the environment of a child becomes very important. And when young children are not being cared for in a positive way or in a productive way, when they're small children, that bonding, that attachment piece becomes compromised. The longer they cry, the more that sense of urgency becomes. It starts to go into that core of the limbic system. They go from being maybe just hungry or unhappy to now they're scared because no one's paying attention. And it starts to create those, again, those memory connections. Some could be good and healthy ones, and some can be damaging. So we know that within the brainstem it creates these emotions. We also know that in the limbic system, that limbic region, that we begin to create opportunities for our brain to evaluate the circumstances and situations that occur and make some simple decisions. Was this a good thing or was it a bad thing? If I cry and I get fed, that's a good thing, and I am more drawn to wanting to communicate so that I can be fed more often. If it's a bad thing, if I cry and I get my hand slapped or I get my bottom spanked because I've cried, I may still not feel better. I may still be emotional, frustrated. I may still be anxious or upset, but I don't want to get my hand slapped, so I'm going to move away from that emotion and try to keep from becoming hurt anymore. So everything that we choose is either going to lead us towards something, hopefully in a good way, or move us away. We'll talk a little bit later about how some of those emotions can get a little sideways through chronic abuse and neglect and things like that. But in general, we're hoping for healthy opportunities for children to understand and learn those ways to evaluate things in a proper way through good bonding and attachment. Another thing that takes place in this area of our brain, this limbic system, is the production of a hormone called cortisol. And this hormone, its main function is to put your body on high alert. In other words, it goes into protection mode. And the overproduction of that hormone through chronic or continual abuse, neglect, stress, all of those different things, can begin to start having some real adverse effects on the brain and its ability to make good decisions and good regulation of self, which we'll talk a little bit more about as well. But clearly, that limbic system, when we talk about students in trauma, it's really this area of the brain that is first impacted and becomes unregulated and unintegrated because of traumatic experiences. Go on to talk a little bit more about memories. We know that again, the amygdala is that part of our limbic system that can also begin to start assigning memory that becomes almost involuntary. So for instance, if you had a scare or a start, something that fearful that had to do with a spider, perhaps. One jumped down and got right in front of your face and it scared you. It could be that every time you come across a spider, your body involuntarily begins to respond just like it did during that event. Children who are in abusive homes start watching for triggers and knowing, when I did this, I got hurt, I got hit, and so they start to assign some of those memories to certain events that will hopefully prevent them from experiencing that again. But sometimes those things just happen involuntarily. Maybe at the time that they were being abused, there was loud music going on in the background, so now when they hear loud music, it automatically puts them into that protection mode or that flee, fight, flight mode, because they associate that sound with a bad experience. So when we talk about how the body or how the mind begins to integrate these experiences, hopefully when they're done appropriately, it helps to kind of fit those pieces together so that children can start making good decisions and assigning appropriate actions by their caregivers and their adults in their life to things that will be productive and helpful to them as they get into their later years. It really is that hippocampus area that begins to put some perceptual memories together that will could guide you through most of your adult life. The next part of the hand model that we're going to talk about are the rest of our fingers, which when they are extended over the top of the limbic system, because we know that the limbic system is buried deep in the center part of the brain, that becomes what we call the cortex. And again, this is a rough representation model, so you have to use your imagination a little bit with some of the science. But this whole area then is truly impacted by everything that's going on within the center part or that limbic area of the brain. So this is the outer protective layer. All thoughts and activities, brain activity that goes on is going to move through the brain, starting from the brain stem in the limbic system into the rest of the cortex. And this is where we begin to start thinking about how we think or thinking about how we learn. One of the big parts of the brain that is important for us to consider is the prefrontal cortex. And with our model, we are going to say that these two fingers here, when they're folded over, are going to represent the prefrontal cortex. This is what we often refer to as the executive function area of the brain. This is where planning, impulse control, working memory, being able to start associating things like risk versus reward, all of these kinds of decision-making processes take place in that prefrontal cortex. We can think of lots of examples of how we have come to adulthood weighing out risk versus reward. For instance, if I want to leave the house, if I want to have one last cup of coffee before I leave, what's the risk that I may run by being late to work, by running into more traffic on the highway? Whereas if I leave a little earlier, what would be the reward that could be waiting for me, such as avoiding the traffic, avoiding the need to speed or get perform some other at-risk behavior in order to get to work on time, and then maybe I can have my cup of coffee when I get to work. So those are all things that are going on in that prefrontal cortex, which is really, again, the area where we begin to have control over our impulses and our thoughts and our actions and our emotions. Some other things that go on in the prefrontal cortex have to do with developing that sense of time. If you remember from some of Dr. Payne's earlier works about understanding poverty, we know that they don't, families that live in poverty oftentimes have difficulty with the concept of time. And it also has to do with your sense of self, your own efficacy, if you will, your own ability to perform tasks and functions and control how you go about performing those things. A big portion of the center part of our prefrontal cortex, this area right in the middle, has to do with judgment. It has to do with the idea of understanding, being insightful about how you approach and think about things. And this is where we see a lot of children from all walks of life now beginning to exhibit some issues with empathy. That's become a big conversation, especially with middle schools and high schools, when we talk about things like restorative practices, trying to teach students that the decisions of their actions and behaviors have impact on others, and understanding and being empathetic to why people are unhappy or scared or frustrated with some of those actions and behaviors. So when we put all of these things together and then start thinking about the idea of what happens when there is an emotional meltdown, we literally find ourselves in a situation where the limbic system has an eruption. Dr. Payne refers to it as limbic lava. And so when that happens, we know that what's going on in this limbic system has literally blocked out and prevented our reasoning center, our prefrontal cortex, from doing its job. The cortisol production is so overwhelming that it literally causes an explosion. So talk with your neighbors about how that might be a model that you would use with your colleagues and maybe even with your students. And as you talk about it, see if you can describe that model, sharing with your partner, each of you an opportunity to repeat that back to your partner. Obviously, our goal is to be able to create a situation where students can give us a signal or let us know with some sort of model like this, hey, I'm at a 4, I'm about to blow. I need some time away, I need a quiet place, I need to be excused to go get a drink of water, I need something to help regulate myself so that I don't have an explosion. And wouldn't you much rather deal with this than this in your face? Just a couple of comments about the development of that prefrontal cortex with students that live in, or children that live in poverty. We know through the research that the prefrontal cortex and the brain itself, quite honestly, in children who have lived in toxic stress, in chronic traumatic environments, that their prefrontal cortex and their brain in general is often underdeveloped compared with children in a more stable, integrated, and regulated environment. The research is beginning to become clear that the damage and the development or underdevelopment of some of these parts of the brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, in children in their preteen years, can create a situation where their brains take on the appearance very similar to that of a senior citizen stroke victim or stroke patient. So it is a significant concern, because we have to think about how we can help those children regain some of that balance, some of that integration and regulation for their future years. Oftentimes we find ourselves seeing, especially young adolescents, teenagers, as they grow into those stages where they start trying to develop relationships with and attachments with someone, and we see them being drawn towards people who are not very healthy for them to be around, much like the environment they grew up in. And we often ask ourselves, why is it that kids that have been abused are drawn to people that are going to be abusers of them as they get older? And it goes back, if you remember a few minutes ago when I said that those risk versus reward opportunities for the brain to become integrated and regulated become muted, if you will, and so they don't understand, they don't weigh the risk versus the reward, because that's their normal. That's what they are accustomed to, and they don't understand that bigger picture of something better that could be in store for them. So when we have young children who come to us with an unregulated brain, with that out of control, explosive behavior, what we really have to stop and consider is, at what point in this child's life was there an event that might have caused them to, for their brains to go into a shutdown mode, if you will, that no further integration, no further bonding, no further attachment has occurred to give that child's brain to begin operating in a more normal, in a more integrated pattern. So, when we talk about kindergartners that come to school and you hear teachers say, well, this child acts like my child did when they were going through the terrible twos. Quite likely, it could be that it's somewhere in that developmental age of that child, they experienced an event that stopped their brain from developing any further in the social, emotional, behavioral arena. And so that's where you have to begin in your schools, thinking about what modeling, what teaching, what positive reinforcement does this child need to get unstuck from that terrible 2s or 3s or whatever the case might be, and get them moving in the right direction towards being able to develop an integrated and regulated brain. One of the techniques that Dr. Payne's group has as an offering to help young children develop some of those skills is a booklet called Teach Teddy. It was written by Dr. Bethany Tucker, and it has a simple concept where it's a kind of a color book type reproducible booklet that you can get free of charge from Dr. Payne's website. And it gives children the opportunity to practice what they've learned from modeling from their teacher or other adults at school. They can teach those skills back to their teddy bear. If the child does well, they can go share that success with the teddy bear, give the teddy bear a sticker, and as the child is teaching their teddy bear these appropriate social, emotional, behavioral skills, the child, as we know, when you teach it, it sticks in your head better than just listening to it. So it's giving the child an opportunity to model and demonstrate appropriate behaviors to their teddy. If the child's having a rough patch and needs a little support, the teacher can encourage them to go get Teddy and take them to a quiet place and have a teaching moment with Teddy so that the child can remember what they need to do to improve in order to help Teddy improve. And you can share this resource with parents or other colleagues as well. The website is from the AHA Process website. It's simply ahaprocess.com/Teddy. And if you, for some reason, have difficulty with that, if you just type in the search bar, Teach Teddy, you'll see an article that comes up where you can download that PDF file. So, one thing that's important to consider is that, you know, it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when you're going to encounter a child who has an emotional meltdown. The severity of it may differ from child to child, but it's almost a given, especially with young children, that it's going to happen. And even with older students, depending on the background of your children, your students, you know the students that you need to be keeping on your radar. If I ask you to write down 5 names of students that you have had challenging experiences with, it wouldn't matter what grade level we're talking about, you'd be able to identify some of those students. So what kind of protocol can we put into place to help us be prepared for that emotional meltdown? The first thing starts with you as teachers. You've got to be able or willing to reframe your thinking about these emotional outbursts, especially from some of the older, you know, upper elementary, middle school, high school kids. Those outbursts can feel really personal. And instead of going into that place of saying, you're being disrespectful to me, you don't like me, you know, I can't believe you treat me this way. Instead of going there with your thinking, instead, we've got to reframe that and think about the idea that this is not about you and that student having a conflict. This is about something that's going on with that child and they don't have the coping skills to regulate and integrate their brains to be able to handle it in a more productive way. And so, obviously, that's where the teaching comes in. Anytime you have an opportunity with a student to be able to contain that behavior somewhere where they won't be harmful to themselves or to others, that's always an important consideration to take. It's also valuable if you can teach children some sort of signal or some sort of process to help them understand what's going on in their brain, much like the hand model that we've been talking about. If you take the time during a period where they're not explosive and out of control, to teach them what's going on in their heads so that they have more tools to communicate with, that's going to be a plus for you and for the child. We're going to talk in a few minutes about some calming techniques that you might consider using. And then finally, what can you do to help that child validate the idea that their emotions are, the emotion itself isn't bad. It's the behavior that goes along with the emotion that can become concerning. And so showing the students that you are willing to listen, that you validate to them what their frustrations or that they are frustrated, that they're angry, that they're unhappy, they're depressed, whatever the case might be, finding a way to communicate with them in such a way that lets them know that you understand and that you care enough to hear, listen, help with whatever's going on. So let's talk for just a few minutes about some of the calming techniques that you might be able to use with children or young adults when they go into that meltdown mode. The first one is simply to give kids a drink of water, not from the water fountain, but to give them a cup of water or a bottle of water. Usually it takes somewhere around 8 to 12 ounces of water to help metabolize that cortisol production. But water is a very quick and effective tool to use to do that. It's important for safety reasons to think about the vessel or container you're going to use, but I found in my years as a principal that keeping some of those small bottles of water in my office close by, either in the nurse's office, in the refrigerator, or maybe just on a shelf in my office where I can reach one quickly and invite a student to sit down and drink a bottle of water, that you can almost begin to see them start to calm down, see some of the tension release from their shoulders and their heads and their backs. And it gets them to a place where you can have a conversation that's more rational, more productive. Another technique that Dr. Payne likes to advocate, and this has appeared in some of her work with the framework of poverty, but it also applies nicely to this, is a technique called future story. I'm going to skip ahead a few slides and talk a little bit about what that future story process is. Basically, you're just asking students to create a document that invites them to think about what they would like to see happen in their future. You can start this with young children, where you just simply say, what do you want to do when you grow up? And let them find pictures or get on the internet and find graphics that represent what that is, and then talk about the importance of learning and being a good citizen and being a good person, and how that will help move them towards their goal to be a policeman or a fireman or a teacher. For older students, her process revolves around creating a 9x9 grid, or just folded paper, that gives them 9 squares where they can begin to find either pictures on the internet or other illustrations in magazines or other periodicals, where they can start to put a visual to what their goals are. For instance, do they want to get a diploma? Do they want to graduate from high school? What do they want to do when they finish high school? Do they want to go to a career school, a career trade school? Do they want to go to college? Do they want to go into the military? What are their next plans? What do they want to do for work? I love the idea of asking them, if you could do anything, whether you got paid for it or not, what job would you like to have? Especially with boys, you can always engage them in the conversation about what kind of car do you want to have. If you could see yourself in any kind of vehicle, what would it be? And then you can start developing that conversation about, you know, if you want to be driving a red Corvette, you're going to have to find a job that's going to provide you with a lot of money, because it's going to take a lot of money to own and operate a car like that. Ask them what they want to do. Where do they see themselves living? Do you see yourself living in another city? Do you see yourself staying close around, maybe on the family farm? What do you see do you want to own a house? Do you want to live in a high-rise apartment building? What kind of friends do you see yourself with in your future? This is a tough one sometimes for kids that have formed some unhealthy friendship relationships because of that risk-reward piece again. So it's important that they give consideration to the idea that is continuing my friendship with this guy who is dealing drugs going to be a safe and good opportunity for me as I grow older? What kind of relationship do you see yourself involved with when you get older? Do you see yourself being married and having children? And then what do you want to do for fun? What would your idea be of a perfect vacation? Where would you like to see yourself going on trips or traveling abroad, or whatever the case might be? So that's the concept behind creating a future story. We know kids from poverty have difficulty planning, so this, because they live so spontaneously, but in the moment. And so this is a good opportunity to teach them to start thinking about a future that's not right there for them to be in the moment of, but something that they can strive towards. The other piece that I think is important to point out about this is that when they have a visual, it seems like images tend to stick in our brains longer at a deeper level than words do. That's why so many marketing companies make such a windfall on creating a graphic logo. The Nike swoosh, you can see that from anywhere and immediately know what that associates with. If we can get kids to be thinking about their future, and they can find some sort of a graphic or representation of that future that image is going to stick in their head longer than the words that might be associated with it. I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about the third calming technique, which is called tapping and touch. In some circles, you may have heard of the term emotional freedom technique. This work is based on the idea of Chinese medicine and science that has to do with different meridians of your body, being able to provide pressure points to relieve pain, to relieve stress, to relieve disease, different kinds of things through things like acupuncture and so on. Well, this isn't quite to that level of acupuncture, but it does have to do with tapping or touching various parts of your body in kind of a sequential manner that is designed to help increase self-image and decrease tension and stress. And we don't have time in today's session to go into a full-blown lesson on how to provide a tapping technique. But what I'd like to invite you to do is look at some of these resources and explore them a little further yourself. And if this is something that you feel like would be beneficial to your students, I would certainly encourage you to do that. For younger children, this is a great resource called Gorilla Thugs and Bear Hugs, and it provides a teaching opportunity through a story approach on how to do a tapping technique with children. There are lots of different books out there on the market about tapping and the healing properties that are associated with the tapping technique. And there's authors now writing books about how to use this tapping technique with different age groups of students, such as the one here that talks about tapping solution for teenagers. And again, that the concept of that is just that it provides pressure points that are assigned to different meridians within your body that under Middle Eastern medicine seem to be, the anecdotal research out there seems to be indicating that it can provide some help and support for kids. The good thing about it is it doesn't cost a lot to learn how to do it, and it's not harmful to children, so it might be worth a try. The fourth technique that's listed on the chart is something very simple. It's just literally looking up. Again, this has a couple of different values to it. First of all, looking up cuts off and stops that cortisol production and the ability for cortisol to be dissipated throughout the brain. And we know from research that as we start thinking about past learning, we oftentimes find our eyes being drawn upward as though we're trying to look for the answer to, in our memory, up on the ceiling. So the idea of looking up also tends to be something that we associate with looking for solutions. We're looking up. When we look down, we have a tendency to associate that with looking for answers through our emotional self, as opposed to looking up where we're looking for our knowledge memory. You'll see people who use this technique having their students write their name across the ceiling so that they have to move their head from one side to the other while they're looking up. You might also see people using some sort of visual imagery where they're asking them to imagine a butterfly that's on the ceiling on one side of the room and watch it flutter across to the other side and then back. So there's lots of different ways to use that technique, but the point is just to get kids out of that emotional hole of holding their head down or hanging their head down and getting them to look up. The next one is breathing techniques. We know, again, that breathing can act much like water in terms of helping to metabolize or dissipate cortisol. And so that breathing technique helps not only to oxygenate the brain and get different parts of the brain functioning in a more healthy way, but it also then helps to control the heart rate, calm it down, and helps to relax students, get rid of some of that tension. So one concept behind that we call controlled breathing is that you just ask the student to breathe with you. Breathe in, hold the breath, and breathe out, and do it together. Sometimes you can even actually start to get kids to mimic your breathing without saying a word, just by sitting down with them, and as they're sitting there, if they're crying and their shoulders are shaking and they're upset, if you just sit and take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, and you're in near proximity to the child, they will eventually just almost involuntarily begin to start their body starts to match your tempo of breathing, and it helps to relax them. The next one that is listed is to pat your heart and your stomach. And while that sounds maybe a little silly, consider the idea that in your stomach region and up here in your chest region, you have a lot of nerve endings that produce what's called serotonin, which is we know from science, is a calming, relaxing hormone. And so the idea of just rubbing your belly or patting your belly or patting your chest or just running your fingers across your chest without even realizing it, you're releasing that serotonin into your system, and it helps to calm you down and help you to relax. And then finally, this last calming technique that Dr. Payne offers is called a simplified EMDR technique. And what this really is referring to is using eye movements in a pattern to help relax students and help them to focus on something different. And you can Google that or do some research on that. There's lots of very clinical applications to this eye movement process, but there are some ways that you can simplify some of them and use them, even if it just means asking students to go move their eyes clockwise and then counterclockwise as you move your finger in front of them. Ask them to follow your finger with their eyes. And it gets that, again, it changes their focus, takes their mind off of the emotional event going on, and by moving their eyes, it begins to help them to concentrate on something different and something that will be get them out of that meltdown mode. One last thing that I want to just briefly touch on too is don't ever underestimate the opportunity to use movement to help students relax and get their mind off of their emotional state. There's a lot of research that talks about exercise as a way to help relax and to burn off some of that energy that is created through those events of a meltdown. Some of you may find yourself saying, I just need to go for a jog around the block, or I need to go for a walk. I need to get up and move around to calm down or to get my mind off of whatever's going on. So this is just one resource that you may want to consider, called SPARK, the Revolutionary New Science of Exercise in the Brain. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, it's not a good idea to take kids for a walk because they may decide to bolt and run, but if you can get them to a slightly calmer state, oftentimes just taking a walk through the halls in the building, asking them to help you move some objects around, maybe go to the library and ask the librarian to, if she needs help moving some books around, things like that. Any kind of exercise or movement that gets kids to refocus on something other than what they're angry and frustrated about. So in review, what we'd like to encourage you to think about is, first of all, can you and would you use that hand model? Can you take that model back and explain it to someone else in your school or in your classroom to your students? And if so, what would be the value of doing that with your kids? Think about those 5 students that I mentioned before. What calming techniques might you want to use with those students? Which ones do you think would benefit the most from some of the different techniques that we offered? And then please, please, please continue the conversation with your friends and colleagues back at school about why it is that we have to reframe our thinking around the idea that students that are out of control and impulsive and have difficulty, that it's because their brains are not regulated and they're not integrated, and it's not because they're just trying to tap dance on your last nerve.